Plan Commission. All right. I'll call the Plan Commission meeting to order at 6:31, and there is a quorum, but let's do a roll call for the purposes of the record.
Okay. President McKay?
Here.
Trustee Bockhorst?
Present.
Dan Wicklund?
Here.
Josh Pollock?
Here.
Therese Klein?
Present.
Barbara Kylie Miller?
Here.
And Eric Kudo?
He's been excused. Or not here.
Got it.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. It's great to see faces and names. Our first, moving on to our second item is approval of the June 1st, 2021 special meeting minutes. Is there a motion?
So
I'll make a motion to approve. Second.
All right, let's unpack that. It was Trustee Bockhorst made the motion to approve with Mr. Wicklund second. Okay, and I see a hand raised. Ms. Miller?
Yeah, I had only one change.
Okay.
And it appears on page 15 of the minutes, which is page 16 of the packet. In the second paragraph, to a comment I made about underground parking being expensive, and I wasn't sure about the rest of that sentence, but what I also said was that the three mixed-use buildings on Oakland and Kensington all provide underground parking, and they aren't any deeper than the lot through the project that we were discussing that night. And I guess I would just like that comment included as well.
Your audio was a little choppy, so I just want to, but it might have been on my end. Did you catch all that, Crystal?
I did. I believe I got the gist of it, but Barbara, if you wouldn't mind just maybe sending it to me in an email as well, that would be helpful.
I will. I'm surrounded by tall pine trees, so there's probably some interference with my transmission.
I'm sure it's beautiful though. Great. Any other comments or discussion about the minutes?
I'm just wondering if everyone's on vacation but me.
No, I'm here. Holding down the fort. Great. Well, I will just say great job, Crystal. This is my first big set of minutes from you, and they're pretty impressive. So I give you the MVP award for the night. So
thank you. They took a while.
Yeah, for sure. So very detailed record. All right. Seeing no other comments, I'd like to take a vote to approve. All those in favor, why don't we do a roll call because some of us are on camera, some are off.
Okay. President McKay?
Yes.
Trustee Bockhorst?
Yes.
Dan Wicklund?
Yes.
Josh Pollock?
Yes.
Therese Klein?
Yes.
And Barbara Kylie Miller?
Yes.
Great, so motion passes. And we can move on to our next item. Really our key item for tonight is the discussion and possible recommendation of modifications to Chapter 535 zoning article 9 off-street parking. The way that I'd like to take this is to hand it over to Bart to do a staff overview and then take public comment from the people who are in attendance this evening, and then open the Plan Commission deliberation. And I will say just at the get-go that, you know, if the commission has a desire to make a recommendation tonight, I will take it, but I am not expecting that because it's a large discussion. So at this point, I will turn it over 3A to cover our overview for this evening.
Okay, thank you, President McKeag. Hopefully I am sharing my screen with everyone here. The information in your packet is meant as an introduction and overview of the existing regulations within our zoning chapter, as well as some general comparisons with our 2 adjacent municipalities, and then a larger, broader overview discussion section at the end, of which I'm looking to perhaps have some feedback from the Plan Commission in preparation for future discussions of possible recommendations to those particular sections. So I will go through these slides here, and then we'll take comments and questions at the end of those. So just as an overview, the off-street parking requirement discussion was a top Plan Commission initiative from both 2019 and 2020. It was second in 2018 only to the comprehensive plan, which we have just completed. So this is something that's been in discussion at least for my entire time here and probably well before that. The requirements have generally been seen as out of date and in need of recalibration, as evidenced by issuance of special exceptions pretty regularly. I would argue they're an example of what is known as zoning by Xerox, where communities simply copy other regulations without respect to context. They're generally suburban in nature, which does not match our land use patterns, and they're irrespective of our historical and existing land use. They are associated with zoning reform to better enable, to enable better places. And I've shared that kind of that path forward with the Plan Commission at previous times as well. Location and design, already regulated by design guidelines, the commercial district. So our commercial district design guidelines do have those components within there. And so a next chapter or next component of that zoning reform that I've shared is to discuss revising the minimums. And then a larger step would be to discuss reducing or eliminating them in certain locations or instances. So I think we are on the path towards this kind of discussion. So it is in line with at least that guideline that has been developed by the Congress for the New Urbanism out of Michigan. Interestingly, I had a chance to go dig into the vault here at Village Hall, and I did find that they were first established in 1941 by Ordinance 688. You likely can't see the screen, but just for reference, a lot of the language is similar and just has been kept since 1951. However, the numbers are slightly different. One of the things that we'll be discussing more in depth later, and as well as probably in July and future meetings is, if you can see on the screen here, 3B for multifamily dwellings of 3 or 4 family units, 1 parking space per family unit was required. For multifamily dwellings of more than 4 units, parking space equal in number to not less than 87% or 0.87 of the number of family dwelling units therein. So it was actually much less back then. Obviously, we're not living in 1951, so I'm not suggesting that we need to go back to 1951 on that. I'm just letting you know that the number over the years has changed. And I think at this point, it's probably time for a discussion of where we need it to be here in 2021. Current planning context, minimums are commonly being reduced locally and around the nation. Requirements were recently actually eliminated in cities such as Minneapolis and South Bend. I shared both those examples as, Minneapolis obviously is a larger municipality with a more robust transit system. South Bend, on the other hand, is not. So it's not limited in scope to various types of municipalities. It is a broader planning context that is being witnessed throughout the country. It's often referenced the high cost of free parking by Donald Shoup. Has been a seminal text on the matter. It notes that providing parking is costly to develop, yet adds little taxable value to the municipality. However, it does have large extraneous costs such as including social and environmental. It does impact the affordability of a place, and it does have equity and inclusivity aspects alongside with it. And on a larger context, it is noted that parking provisions are often better defined by the market. So developers know how many parking spaces they need to rent out to a place. Obviously, it's their money on the line, so they wouldn't develop it if they didn't feel as though people would rent to them with or without it. Whereas as a municipality, it's more widely seen that parking location should be defined by code. So if they're going to develop parking, how and where should it be developed? So this is just kind of the general nature of planning context that I, as the village planner, see within literature and planning conferences throughout the country. I can bring all these conversations into a local context as we get to them, line by line. To that point, Article 9 off-street parking does have various components within it. Of note, the first section deals with when it's triggered. So it's currently triggered by new construction, or what is referred to as substantial alterations. In my memo, I've suggested that substantial alterations is a difficult component to quote unquote, to trigger, simply because a tenant space within a larger building will never meet that threshold, yet perhaps the plan commission or the village would like it to. And so as we go on to future discussion, I'm curious if substantial alterations is actually something that we'd like to keep or modify, perhaps to additions or enlargements or something otherwise, or just remove it, I guess. It also does say that no building permits, occupancy, or use permit shall be issued if parking is provided. However, occupancy and use permits are not triggered, or new construction or substantial alterations is not required for occupancy or use permits. So that's kind of an incongruous section of that. So I'd like to clean that up and just clarify what the Plan Commission would like to see with respect to when these requirements would be applicable. The current code does define the use categories and provide requirements in 4 sections: dwelling and lodging, schools, institutions, auditoriums, and other assembly, recreational uses, and business district use. It also has a section on general requirements, including components of accessibility, location, materials, dimensions, screening, quantity, permission, vehicle type, and maintenance, amongst others. So just we'll be reviewing those general requirements as we go along to make sure that they do meet what we're expecting within the village here. And then, as you're aware, they do allow special exceptions to be considered by the Plan Commission if and when those applications come in being unable to meet the current code. So within your packet, I did provide just a general base kind of discussion on what our current requirements are, what Whitefish Bay and Milwaukee are, as well as in some cases, an example for a national smart code, just kind of giving you an understanding of the local national, or I should say of the national context. I won't go through all of these, but in general, I think the multifamily buildings are what is probably most on people's minds. So in Shorewood, we require 1.75 parking spaces per unit. In Whitefish Bay, for example, and that's on our commercially zoned multifamily districts, which are medium to high density. In Whitefish Bay, they require 1.5 per family, which is roughly the same as a unit. But they also have +1 space for every 10 units. So when those calculations come, their Whitefish Bays are slightly less than Shorewood currently has. And then Milwaukee's is considerably less. They only require 0.67 per unit, or 2 spaces per 3 units. And they also do offer available reductions. So if you're near transit, or if you're near a public parking space, if you're on-street parking, if you're near shared parking, et cetera, you can have an opportunity to reduce that even further. And then just for reference, the SMART code, which is the transect-based urban zoning code model, this is from 2004, so it's probably potentially a little bit outdated still. But back then they were suggesting that 1-to-1 in a commercially zoned multifamily district would be adequate. And I guess for quick reference, Milwaukee did update their numbers in 2002 as part of their zoning reform. And so theirs has been in play for almost 20 years now. And that does cover districts similar to our commercial district. So Downer Avenue, Brady Street, Oakland, et cetera, those kind of east side contexts are covered within calculation. With respect to residentially zoned multifamily, the village does have different requirements. So in our lower density multifamily districts, we require one bedroom units to provide 1 space, 2 bedroom units to provide 1.25, 3 bedrooms to do 1.5, and then we also require that 1 space for every 10 units be provided for guest parking. Whitefish Bay does not have a different category, so theirs are the same. And Milwaukee does have slightly higher requirements in those lower density areas that are not as accessible to transit lines, et cetera, at a 1-to-1, once again, with available reductions. The SMART code, acknowledging that those contexts don't have as much access to transit and things, does also have a higher requirement in its residential zones of 1 to 1.5. And then lastly, in Shorewood, we require our 1- and 2-family dwellings to have 1 per unit. I didn't have a chance to look up Whitefish Bay, but I presume it's similar. In Milwaukee, they actually don't require any sort of parking requirements for 1- or 2-family dwellings. And we can come back to this slide or these statistics if we need to later. I just want to keep us moving along. With respect to assembly uses, I don't want to read all of these, and I don't know that we have that much discussion or controversy on some of them at this point. I think the main discussion points that I'll have is whether or not we can consolidate and provide more general guidance on these and confirm when they would be triggered. Once again, we don't have a lot of built out space that we're looking to add primary or secondary schools. Churches, similar libraries, we're probably built out on that stuff. And so just looking to confirm which of these we need to specify out and which of them we can include within the general assembly category, which we currently have as one parking space for every 5 seats or 90 linear inches of seating space. Milwaukee, for reference, doesn't really have a lot of requirements for assembly uses. Whitefish Bay doesn't list them specifically, so they would be discussed as a part of the special use consideration. Secondary schools in Whitefish Bay are slightly less than we have as well. But I think we can get to these more specifically later on. Office retail use, general office, Shorewood requires 1 space for every 250 square feet. Same thing for general retail. Whitefish Bay has the same as one for 250 for general office, but their general retail is actually slightly less at 1 to 300. On the other hand, Milwaukee is less on both of those, 1 to 500 square feet and 1 to 1,000 square feet. Interestingly, Milwaukee does have different categories for the first 2,000 square feet versus larger. So they acknowledge that the bigger you get, the less they're going to require in terms of office or retail. And actually in retail, they max the number provided at 3.5 to 1,000 square feet. So just pointing out there's different ways to develop these regulations. So they don't just need to be a simple 1 to a square foot or 1 to an employee. They can be developed to perhaps exempt the first X square feet or to change it at a different level as well. Personal services, banks, medical office, restaurants all have various uses in Milwaukee. They reference those back to their general categories, whereas in Whitefish Bay and Shorewood, we still do reference them individually. And they're quite onerous, particularly for restaurants at 1 to 50 square feet, which in this day and age would require a large parking lot. And I don't think that on Oakland and Capitol, that context makes sense anymore. So I'd be looking to have that conversation of how and when we would trigger those requirements for restaurants. A general overview of the discussion points that I've outlined in your packet. The first stage in any regulation would be to understand the purpose and the outcomes of the regulation. Why are we doing this and what is it going to mean? Then I would look towards define the applicability of when they're triggered. Like I said, it's new construction and substantial alteration, but is there a case that could be made for removing or modifying alterations and working with additions instead, or looking at use categories or conversions? So retail to retail doesn't really change the nature of what's going in there, but if it goes retail to assembly, at that point, is that something that the plan commission or someone would like to look at just to confirm that conversion of the land use category would meet the neighborhood expectations? I think the largest task that we'll have in front of us would be to calibrate the requirements. So assuming we keep these requirements for all of these types of uses, understanding what that new or confirm what the current or new figure would be, I would suggest that we go down to 3 categories: dwelling and lodging uses, assembly, and then business, which would include both office and retail. I don't necessarily understand what recreational uses was intended for, but we can have that conversation if we need to. So within each of those categories, I'd look towards discussion of possible reductions or eliminations, location or amenity exceptions. So once again, if you're near transit or if you're near a public parking lot or a public parking ramp, is there a different standard? Opportunities to consolidate and simplify them. I think looking at Milwaukee's example of referencing back to general categories is a lot easier to administer than having individual categories and having to, perhaps put some square pegs in round holes every now and then. And then once again, the discussion of thresholds, perhaps the first X square feet are exempt, or perhaps anything over a certain square feet is a different metric. Just identifying that perhaps we might want to require some parking, but not the same for every amount of square footage. The general requirements, we currently have a pass-through prohibition that doesn't allow you to pass through a parking space. However, we have allowed that in the past via special exception. So, and that was actually through a planned development district, sorry, not a special exception. Just discussing whether or not it makes sense to perhaps consider that to allow maximum use of the space. We have a requirement currently for wheel stops, but we don't enforce that. I would personally like to remove that. That's just an enforcement kind of nightmare. When would screening requirements be triggered? So currently it's only triggered when a new parking lot's developed. That's likely never going to take place. And so the question of triggering that during an occupancy review, I think makes sense. The one example I can think of is the North Shore Pharmacy just redid their parking lot. The design review board did require screening of that parking lot. It went through as a larger occupancy review. So I think that makes sense to perhaps consider screening requirements upon use changes or occupancy changes. Single and two-family home allowances by green space requirements. Currently, single-family homes are only allowed to have one exterior parking space alongside their garage. Two families are allowed to have two spaces outside of their garage. The discussion of whether or not that makes sense or whether we should restrict those based on green space requirements. Currently, single-family and two-family lots are required to have 30% green space. Perhaps allowing a single family house to have two parking spaces along an alley or something would make sense and contribute to less cars on the street and more shared parking elsewhere, as long as they meet the green space requirement. And then we also currently have screening requirements in the backyard, which we don't enforce, I'll be honest. That's never come up in my time, but we do require them on street side yards when people apply to have a parking pad on their corner lot. And then lastly, special exceptions, a discussion of the procedure of that. I know there has been some internal, as well as I've heard it from the public and other members of the Plan Commission and Village Board, as to whether or not the notice procedure on those kind of applications should be amended. So the next steps would be that staff has a goal of providing a recommended draft for the Plan Commission review at the July 27th meeting. So we'll have discussion tonight on those various aspects, anything else that you'd like to bring up. And then I'd be happy to provide a draft for your review, just so that we can get into the nuts and bolts of these kind of conversations and identify what we agree on and what we need more information on. And then just as a reminder, the Plan Commission's role is advisory to the Village Board. So the Plan Commission will be deliberating this and making a recommendation, most likely. That recommendation does get considered by the Village Board after a public hearing and public notice. And so what the Plan Commission recommends to the board might ultimately be changed at the board level. I just want to give you the heads up on that. But the Plan Commission is tasked with providing a recommendation to the Village Board for consideration. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, but I can bring this back up if we need to at any point in the future, and pass it back over to President McKeag.
Thank you. A lot of really rich information. So I guess I'll tweak my comment around I wouldn't expect a recommendation. I think I forgot that we were going to, our goal is to give Bart sort of direction and feedback, just a read of what our thoughts are tonight, so that enough that he can develop a draft. So hopefully we can get there. I think at this time I would like to hear from members of the public who would like to be heard on this matter. We have not received many comments by email. We received one from Trustee Arndorfer this afternoon that will be made part of a future packet, since it wasn't received in time to be part of this record. So I would invite people to raise their hands, and staff can facilitate calling on folks. And I guess I would ask if you can keep it to 2 minutes, that would be great. And we'll go around once, and then we will close public comment and open it up to the Plan Commission for discussion.
Okay, I see Andrew Rothrock has his hand raised. Andrew, if you'd like to unmute yourself, just state your name and address and provide your comments.
Okay, good evening, Andrew Rothrock, 4024 Prospect. Moved into our house in 1998. We talk about 1951 regulations, and I guess I'd point out that my house was built 37 years prior to that, and they saw far enough ahead to build a garage that would possibly fit a Model T or a motorcycle. So we do have a driveway, but we have over the years been pushed back by this green space requirement. As a matter of fact, when we tore up the green middle part of our driveway during a major remodel, we got some indication from the village that we were going to have to pay for that loss of green space, which was just a muddy thing in the middle of our driveway. So we've always been very mindful of the fact that there was the 30% requirement or whatever the number is for the single family homes. Our neighbors on one side built a double garage, the neighbors on the other side were not allowed to build a double garage. So as we talk about extra development and some of these things on the end of our street, When we moved in, we knew that Shorewood was very strict on parking. You know, you'll put comparisons out there to the city of Milwaukee. We lived in 3 different places in Milwaukee and realized we couldn't do that any longer because we might have children, we might have a second car, that sort of thing. So just keep in mind when you talk about 1951 and things like that, you know, a lot of our houses in this village were built before 1951. They were built possibly as old as ours, which was 1914. So just those are some things I'd like you to consider. If we end up with a lot of people parking on our streets day and night, I don't know what kind of exemptions are going to be granted for new construction or apartment buildings or what have you. It's going to be very frustrating to those of us that have made long-term investments in our homes. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, I'm showing Kimberly's iPhone. Kimberly, if you could unmute yourself, state your name and address, and provide your comments.
Hey there. My question is, I believe for Bart. I had received an email sign up to do notifications for village meetings. And I received a message saying my sign up was confirmed, but I did not get any advance notification of this meeting. And I wonder what meetings are included in that notification and how was this meeting communicated to the public? Because my neighbor just happened to email it to me.
President McKeag, sorry to interrupt, but I think we were supposed to ask for the names and addresses.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. My name is Kimberly Lidke. My address is 3900 North Prospect Avenue.
I can look into what you signed up for, Kimberly. Perhaps if you email me or give me a call tomorrow, I can look in our notify me section. If you signed up for the Plan Commission notifications, you definitely should have gotten this one. I sent it out myself, so I know that it was sent. It's possible perhaps you signed up for village board meetings or something else, but to your other question of how this meeting was noticed, the agenda was published last Tuesday on the village website and posted at the 3 locations, the library and 2 at Village Hall that are required by code. So the meeting was noticed as we notice all other meetings. In terms of the email notification, I'd be happy to look into what list you're signed up for and talk you through which ones you might want to add or modify on that selection.
Thank you.
I'm seeing Karen Dessing with her hand raised. If the person on that account could unmute themselves and state their name, address, and provide their comments. Karen, I think you're unmuted, but I still can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Karen Deasing, 3952 North Stoll Avenue. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to make a point about a couple of the items that you indicated in there. Again, you were making comparisons between Whitefish Bay and Milwaukee, comparing that to the village of Shorewood. And again, I would kind of like what my neighbor had also said, I would like you to really consider, are we trying to make ourselves into a Milwaukee? And what kind of neighborhood when you make zoning changes or recommendations regarding the parking that really affects the neighborhood and how it feels and what we're trying to create and what many of us have done in the past to kind of keep up our properties and just the type of environment we're trying to create for our families and friends and neighbors and hopefully future people who will want to move to Shorewood. In addition to that, I also had a comment and something just to keep in mind about your comment regarding the developers and them knowing the markets. I would say that, of course, a developer is wanting to develop and make it most profitable for themselves. So please be considerate of the neighbors who are living around those areas because, of course, as a business person, I would like to make the most profitable development as possible, but that may be to the detriment of the neighbors. So please keep that in mind and do not allow the developers to define the number of parking spaces that are required. Again, I would hope that you would think about the type of environment you want to create in the village of Shorewood. And then lastly, I know that there were green space requirements that were discussed regarding a single family or duplex dwelling units. And I would also like if there might be some recommendations for green space related to commercial developments or multifamily housing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Rosina Bloomingdale, I believe your name's cut off. Rosina?
Yeah, Rosina Bloomingdale, 3958 North Stoll Avenue. And Karen did mention the Whitefish Bay and the Milwaukee comparison, and you had mentioned, Bart, the Downer as examples. You mentioned the Downer and the Brady Street areas, and I've had my nephew live over in the Downer area, and parking is a nightmare over there, and for residents and the like. And as far as Brady Street, I love to go to Brady Street and have dinner and stuff like that over there, but it becomes a huge barrier to me because the parking is, again, such a nightmare trying to find parking, whether that's on Brady Street or down the residential areas. It's just back to back to back to back cars. And so I think that, those comparisons to Milwaukee, we are not a Milwaukee, we are not an urban area, you're right. And so I think that we need to be mindful of what our area is, what we would like our area to be. And yes, we want to be active in development, but we also don't want it to change our neighborhood into an urban looking type neighborhood. That said, it's been because of the development, concerns that, we have had in this neck of the woods. It's very interesting because the parking on Stoll, on just the, the north side. So, literally there are cars parked literally up to the stop sign. So the other day, you have to get out into the middle of the street to be able to even see anybody because you can't see around the parked car at the stop sign. I even took photos of it, and I happened to be sitting outside in my front porch early in the morning, and so it was a person that worked at the vet clinic, and she parked there very early in the morning, and she stayed parked there all the time. And I noticed the same exact thing over on the Prospect Street. That car was literally parked at the stop sign. And so, I think that we need to be I think that we need to maybe survey our own community to find out really what is, how many vehicles are there? How often do they use mass transit? Because we're making speculations based on other communities that really aren't representative of our own. And so I think our best bet might be to survey our community so that we have accurate knowledge on that. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rosina. Next, I have Elizabeth Beagley.
Hi, I live at 2413 East Shorewood Boulevard. I wanted to make a comment. I'm a city planner who worked for the city of Portland as a current planner for 5 years. During that time working in the city of Portland, I watched development happen. We were actually the mecca and one of the best schools to go to where I got my master's degree in city planning was Portland, Oregon's Portland State University. They were at the forefront of what was happening with green streets and getting rid of cars and all of this exciting thing. But when you do this, you have to have the infrastructure behind it that provides the buses and the light rail or other sorts of parking or transportation uses. We have to remember we live in an environment not like Portland. We have 1 week of winter in Portland. In Milwaukee, we have 3 months of winter. We have sub-zero weather where people have to drive to the grocery stores, where people have to drive to work. You know, you can't walk out when it's very cold. We are never going to get to a zero. It would be very unlikely we'll get to a zero use of cars in the village of Shorewood. I will have to say that when I've returned to Portland, I worked on over 200 development proposals while I worked there during those 5 years. I am kind of ashamed of some of the things we created and the problems we created, these very livable neighborhoods. Go to Portland. They were before us when they changed all of these parking requirements. It is a nightmare in Portland now. I have plenty of family members who are living with it. They cannot park in front of their houses. They have to park blocks away. When you go to a party at their houses, it's blocks away again. This didn't work in Portland. It is making it less desirable. People will still continue to move there, but it is not as desirable for the people who are living there. That's all I wanted to say. If you have any questions about city planning, please talk to planners. We have one city planner in the village of Shorewood. In Portland, when I worked on a project, we had 20 planners. We had 10 planners on my team exactly, where I could talk to them anytime. We brought every project to these 10 planners. All of us used our combined information, our knowledge to create the best situations for it. We have 0 planners on our plan commission. This is a tragedy. This is not what we want in the village of Shorewood. We need planners making these decisions who understand the impacts of all of these decisions. I would love to talk to anyone who wants to learn about planning and how these impacts. We have one planner and he's doing a great job, but he's only understands what he knows. We all bring different information and different expertise to the table if you have different planners. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next, I have Shorewood News, I believe.
Hi, thank you. This is Jeff Davidian, 4101 North Prospect. I disagree with the previous speaker who thought that the planners should make the decisions for us. I think the plan commission and the village board should make a decision based on what the public wants and then find a way to facilitate it. There's a reason why there's a public comment section for these meetings and why there are opportunities for the people to speak is because the elected officials are supposed to do what the public wants. And we've seen in the last few meetings where the public has risen to that challenge and they've been slapped in the face. So I think the only way to really make this work, to make decisions about the future of Shorewood, is to come up with a proposal and put it on a referendum and let us vote on it, because the elected officials are not doing what people who live here want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davidian. Next, I have EC.
Hi, my name is Erin Cutraro. I'm at 3915 North Stoll. I actually had a question. I don't know if it's appropriate to ask, but we're relatively new to the neighborhood. I'm so appreciative of all the participation in this conversation. It's exciting to be part of. We moved from an area that faced a similar decision out of state, and ultimately one of the components that was overlooked was something that I actually see here, which is a few or more than a few actually vacant properties. So properties that look like they're waiting to be leased or bought in some way. And a development that happened in the neighborhood actually resulted in it being difficult to actually lease those spaces to businesses that wanted to come in because the parking was so challenging. So I would love to hear at some point just what thought has gone into that, given the vacancies on Capitol. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a clarifying question. Do you mean the commercial vacancies?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I have next DJW.
Thanks. This is Dan Walsh. I live at 4024 North Stowell Avenue. Just a couple quick things. I don't want to take issue or repeat what other people have said, except for to say that we do very frequently bring up how transit affects parking requirements, and alluding a little bit to what Elizabeth Bigley said, we don't have it here. In Shorewood, in Milwaukee, in any of the suburbs, we just don't have a transportation system that anybody can rely on. And I say that certainly some people can do it, but by and large, ridership is down almost 50. It's half of what it was in 1990. So the idea that somehow this density is going to drive ridership and the transit infrastructure is somehow going to replace cars, there's just no data at all to support that. So let's not make zoning changes that are based on a fiction. That's one. Number two, I just don't think the idea of zoning by Xerox is in any way or shape or form accurate. I've lived here for 30 years. Parking has been a fight for 30 years. And the reason it's been a fight is because developers and owners don't want to build it, and residents don't want to have parking sprawling into their neighborhoods. It's always been a fight. And so far, those standards have been set by that fight. I'm not saying they're correct. I'm not saying they shouldn't be changed. But I am saying that they're not fake, they're not made up, taken from somewhere else. They've been fought on over and over and over again. And I don't think it's fair to say that there's no basis for them. They've been very, very aggressively fought over for years. I do want to agree also with Rosina that we have lots of really good information here in Shorewood. We have businesses and we have developers and we have recent developments where we have a range of different parking requirements. Some in parking structures, some on parking lots, some that depend on the neighbors. I think it would not be the hardest thing in the world to get survey information of what the actual requirements of some of these projects are based on some of the data in the projects, the footprint of the units, the number of bedrooms, the total parking that's available, and somehow let's make sure that we pull them on rents as well, because I think there is a very strong correlation between value and rents and taxes and parking and demand. So let's get that information and make a zoning decision based on real information from what's really happening in Shorewood, because we've done an experiment over the last 14 years. Let's figure out how it worked, and then use that information to guide us in making good decisions. And then finally, let's be really clear. Market forces are going to do nothing but advantage the people with the most money and the ability to get large projects approved. It's very hard to be a resident fighting a larger project. And what protects the residents and the occupants and the businesses in a village is the zoning code. So when you start messing with the zoning code and you make special exceptions and you think about creating variances, what you're really doing is saying to everybody, hey, we're about to make some changes and things are gonna be different. And that's why the neighbors get upset. Like, well, we don't know what those differences are going to be. How do we know what's going to happen based on this change that you're about to make? Why don't we do it with a little bit more information? And that's why we asked the developer who asked for a special exception to bring real, valuable, reliable information instead of nonsense to meetings. So let's just make sure that we get the right data. We make this decision and we don't rely on market forces to protect the charm of the village. Thanks very much for considering these things.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I'm not seeing anyone else with their hand raised at the moment, so just want to remind you to raise your hand and I can call on you if you have any comments to add.
I'm trying to raise my hand.
Sure, is this Steve?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I'm Steve Filmanowitz from 4314 North Stowell Avenue. And I believe Shorewood is an urban suburb with a good supply of parking. We have underused properties and underinvested properties along Capitol, and new investment will help to make our neighborhood more vibrant, enrich our tax base in a much needed way. If we turn away development because of a concern about parking, we're making a decision to keep our city and our tax base underdeveloped and really creating an increased tax load on all existing property owners. I know there are concerns about parking, but I believe that these plans will add parking. Also, homes and businesses in the area have a good ability to absorb parking already off street and garages and driveways. So I believe that really, the new development will add parking, just not at the unrealistic rate required by the old requirements. So I just think vacant and underused properties are a bigger problem, and parking is a much smaller problem.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Sure.
Is there anyone else with comments tonight?
Art?
Yes.
If I may, I would just want to remind everyone to please mute your devices. I see at least 4 or 5 people not muted. And anyway, just friendly reminder.
Sure. Not seeing anyone else with their hands, I would turn it back to you, President McKeag, if you'd like to make the decision to move on to the next component or ask once more.
Yeah, I would like to ask once more if there's anyone else. And please remember, if you don't, if you think of something after the meeting, you can certainly submit your comments in writing via email, and they will become part of future records. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, no one else with their hand raised.
Okay. With that, I will close public comment and open it up for to hear from the plan commissioners. Of course, you can share whatever responses you want, but some things that I heard Director Bart ask is if we can simplify any, sort of what your interests and concerns are around simplifying some of the categories that we have. I'm definitely interested in sort of your, what's resonating with you, what questions you have, what information is missing for you, so that we can definitely have that for next time. And any thoughts about ratios, reductions, General Assembly, office retail, things like that. So at this time, we can perhaps go around once and see how people are thinking and what they're needing, and then we can decide where to go from there. Start with Barbara.
You're still muted, Barbara.
Oh, okay. So I was not going to read you my 3 pages of notes, but I made a few comments reading the packet. And I wanted to start off by saying that we added this to our Plan Commission initiative list a couple of years ago because it was asking us for a parking exception. Now that included places like, the Ruckus and the North Shore Bank. Both of those had access kind of like across the street to public parking structures. And then smaller shop businesses like Soul Cycle, Exercise, Studio, Fiddlehead's Coffee Shop was a recent one. Construction or change of use, or what was the other one, Bart? Oh, major renovations. And so that's kind of why we wanted to look at this. Not because we were unhappy with requirements for parking for residential developments. And so I'm not sure if this, as you said before, this is kind of a big piece of policy and zoning code to take a look at. We might want to think about looking at these one at a time instead of trying to solve the whole puzzle at once. It's also difficult because I know that Commissioner Kudo's not here, but it often seemed like we were counting the same number of parking spaces on Oakland more than once, you know, like, so every time we'd get a new request, we'd say, okay, there's so many number of parking spaces, but it's like, right, except we were counting those for the last business. So, and there's also a difference between people who are coming to a 1 hour exercise class or having dinner for 2 hours versus an employee who's going to be parked for 8 hours. So I think that's kind of a tricky thing to figure out when we're requiring parking spaces based on the number of employees or square footage. And so those are just some things to think about. I do agree with some of the residents who spoke that Shorewood is a city, and it's important to remember that we're not a city, we're a village, and basically a bedroom community where most residents are working either elsewhere in the county or beyond. So I think that, comparing us to major cities that have central downtowns is not really that relevant. I don't mind the comparison to Whitefish Bay because they're similar to us as far as size, less rental units for sure, but more of a similar kind of community. And I guess if we want to keep comparing ourselves to Milwaukee, I really have to wonder why we're maintaining an independent village, as an entity. Why don't we just ask Milwaukee to annex us? I agree with one of the residents who said that parking around Brady Street is a nightmare and virtually impossible. Downer is a little bit less difficult. But anyway, I think those are my thoughts for now.
Thank you. Barbara, I really appreciated how you said kind of like, I guess, if you break down the different sections of the code and sort of, if people can reflect, if commissioners can reflect on what's an easy decision, and what's a harder decision, and what it would take to, I guess, what level of change you're comfortable with. You're not committing to anything tonight, it just gives us a sense.
I see Josh has his hand raised. President McKagan.
Oh, thanks. Commissioner Pollack?
Yeah, I was just curious about the data question. I had some more questions and I had them bucketed into two categories. One, what parking studies we should be looking at that would help us understand how parking is currently utilized within the village. And then two, Bart, you mentioned that we have a history of granting exceptions or variances for parking. Just curious if there was any analysis on the frequency of those exceptions, just to get a baseline of what the functional parking requirements were in practice.
I don't have that information offhand, but we do have it and I can provide it. It was discussed earlier as part of the February Plan Commission, I believe, and I think is where Barbara's probably pulling some of the listing from. But I can definitely prepare, perhaps the last 10 years, the discussion of parking special exceptions together, and what those ratios were that were provided, and that will give you some example of the recent developments and how that's looked within the village. I have that noted down for next time to bring that back to you.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to say that to make a distinction, and so our code holds the parking requirements, which then we offer special exceptions get triggered. but then the businesses provide the parking. So there's parking provision versus parking requirements, right? So what you were asking about is when we give a variance, how many spots are actually provided versus what our code requires. So like what actually is the variance? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah. So like if the code says the ratio is 1.75 per whatever, but we keep granting variances at a rate of like 1.25, then we know that a 1.25 rate keeps the quality of life about like this. And so that would be a good way to benchmark what the status quo actually is rather than referring to the code that's 50 plus years old.
There you go. Thank you. Trustee Bockhorst.
Thank you. So thank you, Bart, for the presentation and for outlining a lot of things. I guess I want to start just mainly with just procedurally. One of the things I'd like to look for when you bring it back to us after this in subsequent discussions, perhaps, if possible, would be maybe we can have like a red line and a green line system, meaning some of the recommendations from staff and whatnot. And then perhaps in one color, and I mean, we can go over this later, but then the red line of the existing code within the new recommendation. But I'll stop there because you probably already were planning on doing that. I also appreciate the question that Josh had mentioned regarding which studies we've looked at, because we hear a lot that, you know, we don't have data and a lot of misinformation and stuff like that. But this, our decision making here, I would love to, you know, again, get the qualified list of that. The thing that strikes me about this, and I'm very grateful we're discussing this, because on the village board since I was first elected in 2013, we have dealt with numerous, as Josh and Bart had mentioned, exceptions, and we have discussed changing this code because it is antiquated and formulated in 1951. That's more than a half of a century ago. And our village sure has undergone a lot of change. And fortunately for a lot of us, life now is a lot different than 1951. I also want us to keep in mind the multimodal options and opportunities that do exist in Shorewood. In addition, the ones that we had in the past and maybe we'll bring back. It's hard for me because both bubbler bikes and Zipcar were initiatives that I brought forward. And hopefully we'll see a return of the bubbler bikes. Zipcar was, I think the company went under, or they determined that they didn't want to be here anymore. It wasn't a decision like the removing bubbler bikes that the last board had made, which was very, very difficult. But we do. So a couple of other things I want to say is that I appreciate that that you're using the, I wouldn't call it a comparison. I never got the picture that you were comparing Shorewood to Milwaukee or comparing Shorewood to Whitefish Bay or other municipalities. What I heard is that you're gathering data, which is something that we all have to do all the time, especially when we're making policy decisions. We gather data from what other municipalities are doing, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. So thank you for using strong data in order to inform us in this process. Ms. Kylie Miller brought up a really interesting point that I'd like us to also keep in mind, and Bart, you mentioned this earlier, parking requirements for both short and long-term use. I've heard a lot of frustration from people that there are employees that are parking on some of these streets for all day and they're not moving their car once, whether or not, so that's, we've dealt with that at the village board level in the past. This happened in the business district up north of, or around Kensington Square, where we worked with business owners, the bid worked with business owners to get their extended parking for their employees to use municipal lots. And we can incentivize that too if we need to, as a municipality, but probably won't have to. But I understand that the employees of some of the businesses, for example, the animal hospital, their cars might be out there for 8 to 10 hours, taking up prime real estate for parking. We can find a way, or maybe we change the code and there are certain things that we can't allow that. Short-term parking, people coming 1 hour, 2 hour or less, movement of and bringing vibrancy and stuff like that. So let's see, I'm sorry. I'm sure we'll get to some of this other stuff, but I also, we have done a variety of visioning processes, and I would like that maybe going forward we could recommend, or I'm not recommend, we could remind ourselves and the commission. I know Josh and Therese, and a lot of you probably weren't involved in our planning, our Vision 2025, or comprehensive, a lot of the different comprehensive plans that we use to make our decisions here in Shorewood, and that we worked with consultants and a variety of stakeholders, many neighborhood meetings, a lot of input, a lot of public input. So I know that sometimes people don't feel that input is being heard and considered, but I can guarantee that that's not the case. I also, sorry, let's see. I feel that we have received a variety, and will continue, and we look forward to, I do at least, the public input on all of the decisions. And I know right now that it can be a little, when this is a project, when a project is near someone, for example, the Metro Market project, we had a lot of people come out and say, no, don't let this be built, this and that. But we do have to think globally. And I know that the change can be difficult, but anyway, I'm glad that we're using qualified data, and that our zoning is not just, copying someone else. We're really being thoughtful here and thinking about and looking at the differences in the municipalities, and then tailoring our zoning code to the needs of our municipality, and using the real information that we have. And, this is not speculation. This is not grasping. And so anyway, I look forward to, I just wanted to make some of those reminders for people, because I have been through a lot of these meetings, not just planning commission, village board meetings, my day job at the city of Milwaukee. I deal with this as well. So I'm very appreciative of that. And also, like Ms. Bigley, I'm from originally the DC area, but also lived in Seattle, which underwent, in the two different times I lived out there in the 90s and in the 2000s, tremendous growth. And it's a larger city, just like Portland is, that the zoning code, we're fortunate, tremendous growth and maybe some poor decisions, but that's hindsight. But we do have the luxury of a 1.5 square miles in this municipality. So we do, I know, Bart, you do collaborate with other planners, and including with the city of Milwaukee. I've been, set you up with, and we've been part of many discussions, and with other municipalities and the League of Wisconsin Municipalities as well. So I just wanted to mention that, and I look forward to this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Commissioner Klein or Commissioner Wickland, would you like to speak?
Yeah, I can chime in here. I agree with a lot of the comments that made. First of all, it's great to have a robust public comment as well. I think that's really helpful, and that was helpful in the last meeting as well. I think that one thing I want to keep in mind is kind of what Josh said, and Bart, I guess my request is looking at these exceptions we've granted in the past. Barbara brought it up too. I've sat through all these ones, whether it's a chiropractic clinic or a restaurant or a daycare. I mean, these are always in front of us for parking exceptions. So I'd like to maybe see over time, just like we saw for the project on Capitol, exactly what we've done in the past for some of these. And maybe you're already basing some of your recommendations that you're looking at on that. But I'd like those recommendations to be based in things we've done before, as well as some of the data you've already put out. I appreciate the articles you sent. I think those are helpful. And, I think we want to make sure we're framing this around the entire village too. I know the public comment was focused a lot these past meetings off of that project on Capitol. If you look at all the public comment, it's been from people who live within a block and a half of that new project. So, we've had this before on other projects as well. Every time we grant a parking exception, it's tough for the neighborhood, and I feel for the neighbors. So we want to come up with something smart, well thought out, and grounded in data that we can look at and say, this is good, and we can rely on it. Because, I think some residents are saying, hey, we don't want to cater to developers. But as I mentioned in our last meeting, our comprehensive plan is based off of, putting together new development in the region and growing the community, growing residents to lower our tax base. And the corridors to do that are Capitol and Oakland. So as we do that, I just want to be smart about it, but I want to make sure we have something the village board can rely on and then have a reasonable discussion around.
Thank you, Commissioner Wickland. I just wanted to do a clarifying. You just made a statement that you want to lower the tax base. I think you might want to say lower the tax burden, but expand the tax base.
Thank you. Yep, misspoke. Appreciate that.
No problem.
Crystal, make sure you note that I did misspeak. Maybe you can make me sound smarter in the minutes.
It's common. I just did the same thing in an email a couple weeks ago, and then I thought of it when I was in the shower. So I'm like, oh my God, I got to correct that. Okay. Commissioner Klein.
Yeah, I agree with quite a bit of what everybody says. A lot of what I'm in line with what Dan Wickman just mentioned. So I wanted to thank Bart for bringing this forward and the proposal. I do also want to mention I like the idea of simplifying the code. There's a lot of things in there that don't need to be so specific. There's really very few categories. And I'd like the Plan Commission to have a little time to talk through that, see some of the data that was asked for, right, and talk through what our goal really is here and what we're trying to implement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think as I'm listening, you know, I'm wondering if a good exercise for us tonight would be to, Bart, if you could kind of, I hesitate to put people off screen because then it's hard to see responses. However, what I'm thinking of is we kind of have one set of questions, which is, can we simplify the code? And what's our comfort level with doing that? Because I think it makes a lot of sense. And then the big money question is, do you want to change the parking requirement? And that's the one that kind of everybody goes, you know. So I'm wondering if we could do the simplification kind of questions to see where people are comfort-wise with, are you comfortable simplifying this? And then if we can just go around and see ballpark where the commission is on changing the parking ratio, and that might get us to a pretty good place. Does that sound? Maybe I'm oversimplifying the simplifying.
I was gonna say, I'd be happy, and I mean, I can share the screen again if you'd like, but in my discussion slides, I think there was just 5 components of it.
Okay.
The first one, I think that would help me, because I am comfortable providing you with a draft of what I'm hearing and what I think as the zoning administrator makes sense in terms of these general concepts, and those specific requirements, I think, is where I'm going to need your more specific input. And it definitely sounds like you want more data to make that input. So I think the numbers component of the discussion, we're not quite there yet. But the other component, I'd be happy to perhaps just remind everyone what my questions were. Mm-hmm. The first one was with the applicability of the code, when it should be triggered. So currently it's triggered for all new construction. I think that's a very clear trigger, and it makes complete sense. However, we also have this category of substantial alteration, which relates to the value of improvements within the building. So if you're a tenant within a 10 tenant building and you make improvements, you're never going to meet that threshold to require it. And so just from an administrative standpoint, unless the Plan Commission sees reason to keep substantial alterations, it'd be my discussion point as to whether or not we want to remove or modify that to relate to substantial alterations or enlargements or use changes when the use category of a building changes. So like I said, when it goes from retail to retail, is there an expectation that the parking should change? I'm guessing not from previous conversation and previous special exceptions, but when it goes from, say, office to a restaurant, at that point, you might want to look at the code as to whether or not you want to review it in terms of the local context in the neighborhood. So I think that the first topic I'm looking for in terms of simplifying it would be to simplify and make it clear on the application of when the code would be triggered. And so if anyone has any comments on that, I'd be happy to reconfirm them and bring those back in July with more simplified language and perhaps a more clear trigger on those conversations.
So the choice is to leave as is, to check, are we in agreement that it should be all new construction, and then the substantial alteration category, whether we should remove it altogether or clarify it?
Yeah, I would leave that to you. I would say, in my opinion, as the zoning administrator, I would probably remove it because I don't know that it makes sense. Because I think the alteration, you know, if you're a restaurant and you want to fix up your restaurant space, why would we quote unquote punish someone by having them fix it up and say, oh, and when you do that, you have to add a parking lot when it's already a restaurant?
Mm-hmm.
Difference would be if you want to add, you know, if you want to double your square footage, or if you want to go to a more intensive use. I think that to me makes more sense as a trigger. I don't think we as the village should be, you know, looking to punish someone, quote unquote, for improving their space. But I think in terms of parking, it makes more sense to look at it when you're adding space to it, similar to new construction, or when you're intensifying the use, going from perhaps a light office or more storage kind of space to a more intensive restaurant, bar, tavern, assembly area. So that's where I would look towards you as the plan commissioners to, you know, confirm my thinking on that or provide me with other examples.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go kind of lightning round if possible. I mean, I don't want to discourage discussion, of course, but if it's easy, right? So let's go around and see who confirms Bart's thinking or who has a challenge to it or something to add. So
I confirm.
Confirm. Wicklund confirms.
I confirm.
Confirm. Confirm. Bockhorst.
I'm going to go even further. I think anytime you have an enforcement question where the trigger is ambiguous or you don't like it, we shouldn't have laws that we're not enforcing or we can't practically enforce. It just invites discriminatory enforcement. So confirmed and go further.
Thank you.
Like that.
Commissioner Kyler Miller. Raise of hand is a confirm.
Sorry, I lost my video.
Oh.
No, just 1 second. I lost my audio for a second and I lost my video. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, could you hear me now, President McKay?
Oh, we did, and then maybe you dropped out.
Yeah, I was having some hit the wrong thing and my video was disabled. Okay. I'm of two minds about this. I agree with Bart that if the use stays the same, whether it's retail to retail, exercise to exercise, medical clinic to medical clinic, we shouldn't, you know, kind of recreate the wheel by asking the new tenant to meet standards that the old one didn't have to, or that were impossible to meet. You know, some of those buildings on, like where City Market is, and you know, there just isn't parking. So we just have to be realistic. That's the way it was developed. That's the way it was built. When you have new construction, you know, like say when the Shorewood Press building was going to be sold and North Shore Bank was coming in, number one, yes, we did want to have screening. That's an example of a new parking lot that was being created. And, you know, it was a totally different use. So I think when we have new construction, not only should everybody be notified, but, you know, we have to kind of look at it with fresh eyes. I did agree with, I guess I found it interesting when Bart said we don't want to punish someone for improving their space, because listening to the residents who live off of our main business corridors, I think they would say that they're the ones who are being punished. And there was something on the very first page of this discussion, page 21 in our packet, where it talked about, you know, these off-street parking requirements. You know, it really falls on the adjacent neighborhoods. And I'm concerned that we are, you know, why are we asking these residents of many decades to sacrifice for the greater good? I mean, I've lived on the 4,000 block of North Downer for 30 years. So I understand that. I will say I was thrilled with the way that Hayek's drugstore was renovated instead of being, taken down and replaced. I think it's important to separate those issues, though. That uses, if the use is going to stay the same, let's let that go. If the use is going to be substantially different, I think we need to look at it, and maybe require some more information. And also, my last thing I wanted to say was that someone had mentioned doing surveys of our properties, and I had thought of that myself. Maybe after receiving Trustee Arnhofer's email today, with all the apartment buildings we have, it would be really interesting to find out from the owners, the tenants, how many bedrooms and how many cars do they have? What are their actual to build village? Anyway, that's it.
Thank you. Did you get that part?
Yeah. Yep, in general.
Great. So, and I confirm. So that looks like a general consensus for confirming the direction you're going. Okay.
Much appreciated. Yes.
Next question.
So then the next question, and we can skip the numbers in and of themselves right now, would be with respect to the current requirements. So we have 4 sections. The first one is lodging and dwelling. The next one is related to assembly. Then we have recreation, and then we have business district uses. Within my presentation, I noted I'm not sure what the recreation use relates to. It's worded as recreation, commercial, and non-commercial, but we don't build new parks. We don't have occupancy for parks, things like that. So that really is a village discussion. We don't have private parks coming in. So unless someone here has any further thoughts on that, I would suggest we consider removing that and thinking of when it would be applicable, and going down to 3 sections. 1 based on lodging or dwelling, 1 based on assembly areas, churches, libraries, things of that nature, and then specific to businesses, which businesses we think would make sense to trigger it. And so that would be, I guess, my first question, looking for confirmation of going from those 4 categories down to those 3. It's not a huge question, so I hope there's not a lot of debate on that, but that would be my recommendation, is that we go from the 4 categories down to the 3, just to simplify the number of potential ratios that we have to confirm.
I would say for this one, if we could signal with a thumbs up, or the people who aren't on camera, you could say yay or nay. Oh, Dan with the quick thumbs up. Nice. Barbara, if you have an emoji you can throw up there, is that a thumbs up? We're gonna go do it with a wave. I'm gonna say we have consensus on that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So Barbara, for the purposes of this, we'll say hand up is a yes and blank is a no. How about that? In case your audio is not working, but otherwise you can just chime in. Okay, next question, Bart.
Yeah, so then one of the things that I discussed and noted in Milwaukee's example, and once again, I'm not trying to say that we are Milwaukee, I'm just pointing out, local examples as whether or not there are certain thresholds or location or amenity exceptions that we'd like to be built in or considered in the code. So for example, if you're near a public parking structure, the village did spend a lot of money to, develop several of those, and we do have public parking lots. Is that something that we look towards perhaps giving credit towards, or other codes give credit towards providing bike parking or electric vehicle charging stations? Maybe that's a larger discussion. I'm just looking for a direction as to whether or not you want me to research things like that.
Can you clarify what you mean by credit? Was that also a reduction?
Yes, so a credit would be a reduction, right? So,
okay. Yeah.
Right, if the code required you ultimately to have 50 spaces, but we would reduce it by 5 if you were located within X feet of something. Mm-hmm. And once again, I'm not looking for the numbers on that. I'm just looking at whether or not that's something that we're willing to, research or compile for our next discussion. And so, yeah, I guess I'd leave it open to that kind of.
Sad trouble, no picking up strange guys.
That was great.
Yeah. So I would say thumbs up if you're comfortable considering reductions or credits, and Bart can bring back information. Okay. And
since you
Barbara?
can't see my thumb.
Yeah. What is your thumb?
The only I have a caveat on this.
Sure.
My the only thing I would say is we have counted those same spaces so many times that we would need really to know how many spaces on those lots are already committed. Like the Ascension Health Clinic that went in were used to be, some of those spaces in the lot behind it came with their lease or with their the number of spaces. We need to know how many are already spoken for. Otherwise, you know, I'd be moving favorably in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be happy to clarify or try to make that clear within the code when spaces do qualify or when they don't qualify. So I can look at that.
That's great, thank you. Barbara, I'm just gonna say, since your audio is a little glitchy tonight, I really like your comments and questions, so I'm hoping you are taking good notes and maybe you can submit them in writing to make sure that we didn't miss anything. Would you mind doing that?
Will do.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, I'd appreciate that as well, Barbara. And you always are good at providing comments, so I had no doubt that you would.
Okay, good. I didn't know what the procedure, you know, kind of the process. All right, next question.
So the last one that I had in terms of the requirement section is whether or not we want to look at different thresholds. So for example, perhaps the first X square feet of retail doesn't require it, but you know, once you get to become a big store, we've discussed that with respect to conditional use permits for medical offices, where the Plan Commission is oftentimes reviewing a conditional use permit for a small clinic. And pretty much the comment is always like, well, this is so small that it's not really impactful. But if we're, you know, 4,000 square feet, we definitely want to see it. So we don't want to remove clinics from conditional use permits, but we also don't need to see the smaller versions of them, right? So if we, using that same logic, we're willing or comfortable building in some sort of thresholds for, yes, perhaps a large restaurant or a large medical clinic, and we can define the number for large as we calibrate the number, perhaps that would trigger it. But for example, if the average, you know, if the average retail or small square footage, small floor plan of our business district is, you know, 1,000 square feet, and we know that that's what's been developed there in the past, and we know that we're living with that history, perhaps we have a threshold that says if you're in that kind of category, we don't look at it. But if you're looking to, you know, redevelop the district and make it, you know, new or different and put in, you know, perhaps a big box or some sort of, you know, more corporate footplate, then we would look at it. So there's my long introduction to whether or not we're willing to look at thresholds within the requirements to say when at a certain point they become triggered and below a certain point they would be exempted.
All right, let's go with the easy route and see if we have a thumbs up, and if we don't have consensus, we'll dig into it a little bit. And as always, people, commissioners, please comment as you see fit. But I would say I'm open to looking at thresholds, learning more about that. Okay. All right.
No big box stores in Shorewood.
Don't worry, Barbara, that was just conjecture there. No, that was just hypothetically. I knew we were going to get a trigger.
Only because a few years ago, Bart's predecessor brought us the idea of some large discount store. And I think we're all appalled, and that didn't go any further.
Well, I got a question. I want to apply thresholds for sure, if I'm understanding this right, to things like, you know, Bart brought up in his presentation, restaurants. And, you know, we realize that our restaurant code for parking doesn't even make sense, right? I mean, we can't hit with anybody. But then if you have a McDonald's, for instance, right, that's different. You know, everything's different. So I'm wondering how we, and I don't want to tackle individual ones on this one. I kind of want recommendations, but how do we tackle that, I guess, and is that a threshold issue?
Or is it kind of a type of business that's desired or not desired, or?
I kind of struggle with your example, Dan, because when I think of McDonald's, I think of a drive-through, and so that.
Yeah, I guess. I'm good with terrible examples, but let's call it a Denny's, right? I know that doesn't exist, but I'm just saying, you know, we used to have Big Boy and all these other ones. If you look down, whatever where Culver's was used to be a sit-down restaurant. So, I mean, if we have large ones like that require a lot of parking, a Red Lobster, okay, very different than, you know, a Cloud Red. Right. So, you know, and maybe that's not a threshold issue and bringing it up at the wrong time, but that's something I was thinking about.
Interesting. Is that sort of related to occupancy?
I don't know.
I don't know. Okay, Bart, you have to figure that out.
I was gonna say, my quick response to that would be that's I think a threshold would help with that respect, just because usually independent, smaller restaurants don't have the capacity to, you know, develop that parking. Whereas if we're talking about a Big Boy or a Red Lobster, things like that, they have corporate requirements or larger standards that wouldn't allow them to franchise into a location without that parking. So once again, it wouldn't be that we're requiring the parking, it'd be that their corporate, you know, market forces would say, we're not gonna invest in this property without that. So that actually often benefits the smaller spaces to be open to more independent, locally run kind of restaurants like that. So if we have that threshold that kind of incentivizes small scale developments or restaurants or reuse of that space, I think that goes hand in hand kind of with that conversation and the desire to maintain, you know, a local unique feel. So I think, and I can prepare that perhaps in a little better of examples if I need to, but I think that does go with the threshold conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I think, what'd you say, we're 1 in 50 right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's just stupid. So, you know, we need to come up with something else, but I just want to make sure we're not being stupid about it either, as with most of these things, but I just thought it fit on the threshold.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I know Corner Bakery was an example of that spot worked for that franchise because it requires that kind of parking. Mm-hmm. Trustee Bockhorst.
Thank you. I don't know if this falls in this category of the thresholds, but one of the things that you had mentioned earlier, Bart, and forgive me if this is out of turn, is that medical centers and things like that, you know, different requirements. Those are some of those things I would like us to potentially keep in. One of the contingencies in the developers agreement for the metro market was that they could not use the retail space for at least 10 years for any of those kind of needs, things that don't bring in, you know, vibrancy and a variety of things. So whether or not it's the right decision, I'm not sure, but just keeping that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, understood. Thank you. So yeah, with respect to the 3 general categories, I will be researching or providing a recommendation for a general use category, but then keeping specific ones. And I'm sure medical and clinics will be one of those, perhaps with a threshold, et cetera, but not as detailed as I think right now we have like aquariums, you know, in part of the section. Mm-hmm. I don't know that that's necessarily relevant or where that came from, but I think taking the opportunity to kind of get those kind of outliers out of there and just confirm what specific ones that we want, and then keeping a general category that we can, you know, review those applicants against would make sense. So those are my questions with respect to the requirement section. And then the last questions that I had raised were well, I guess there's 2, I guess. The general requirement section. So within that, I just discussed a handful of odd things that I think, you know, either haven't been enforced or you know, just I don't understand where they're coming from. So that the pass-through prohibition, once again, precluding tandem parking spaces. The Collectivo, the Cornerstone building, and in their underground parking, they do have front to back parking. So if you rent one of the units and you want 2 spaces and you control that, it'd be like your driveway, you know, making sure your, you know, your roommate, your neighbor, your partner, whoever gets out early in the morning. That's how a driveway functions, but it allows them to maximize the use of that space. And so we currently prohibit that, but we did allow it as an exception through a planned development district. So just kind of clarifying whether or not, and I can bring these all, you know, one by one back next time, but yes, go ahead, President McKeag.
Can you tell me why the prohibition on that? Like, what's the thought there? What's the fear?
I don't know what the fear is as long as you control both spaces. And so I understand the fear if you're parked in and you can't get out, you know, that makes sense. I just think perhaps they weren't contemplating that scenario, which is why the plan commission and board, you know, didn't reject that as part of the plan development district agreement for the Cornerstone. Mm-hmm. It has come up time to time in terms of like businesses saying, well, I want to stack my employees back there and I have space for it. But our doesn't allow it. So right now we say that's only one space. But if we said, okay, as you as the business owner are comfortable with your employees being stacked back there and having, you know, getting access in and out, it's a benefit, I think, to the village to get those spaces onto the private property and off of curb parking. Mm-hmm. So allow stacked parking or tandem parking or something of that nature within a certain, arena. You know, if you control the parking, we're okay with it. If you don't, then you can't do it, right? You can't have customer parking stacked. That would make no sense. But I just think there's a way to better write it to allow the flexibility and provide that opportunity to maximize the use of our land, which is limited as in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So
okay, show of thank you for that clarification. If there are no other questions, kind of show of hands of thumbs up if you're interested. Okay, it looks like we have thumbs up. So it looks like I'm going to take it that there's enough understanding that we are asking you to bring something back to us. I have a question sort of related to that. Is there ever, are there parking codes that cover valet parking?
I'm sure there are. I don't know if they would be offhand, but I'm sure it'd be under some sort of shared or offsite parking requirement component. And I think perhaps an example of that might be, someone like the Atrium, if they had a valet service and parked it in the Village Hall lot. Mute this. There we go. So like, yeah, assembly uses, if you had weddings or things of that nature where there was a valet service and you had a lot that you had access to a couple blocks away, would we give credit for that? I think that'd be something worth discussing.
If you could make a note just to sort of look into that to see if it's possible. Because I remember there were conversations before about creative ways around using shuttle services, like Hubbard Park Lodge using shuttle services for guests and things like that. So I appreciate that. All right, next question.
The next one's kind of a boring one, but it's in there. So we currently require wheel stops in parking spaces, particularly up against the public right-of-way. This was a big actually conversation when I was in West Allis as well, because it becomes an enforcement nightmare because we have plowing in Wisconsin. And so the moment you plow, those wheel stops are all over the place, and they'll be on the sidewalk, they'll be in an alley, they'll be in the landscaping. They will not be replaced in the spring. I understand the reason for why it was put in place to not let cars, drive into landscaping or drive into alleys or drive into sidewalks, but that really is the responsibility of someone parking that car. And I think the wheel stop, just goes too far, unless for some reason we in Shorewood want to start requiring it. Although it's in the code, we have not, to my knowledge, ever required that in anyone. I just want to get rid of it if possible.
Okay, show of hands. It looks like we're in support.
Yeah, I'll bring this back.
I'm actually.
Yes, Barbara.
I raised my hand because I actually had a quick question for Bart. What is the purpose supposed to be? Is that so someone doesn't, not hit the brake and they go over that public right of way or hit somebody on the sidewalk? What's the purpose of those wheel stops?
Yeah, I think it's actually stated in the code. The purpose is to make sure that cars stay within the parking lot so they don't encroach into landscaping or over the sidewalk or onto the alley, so they allow for that to happen. But I don't know that the wheel stop is the proper trigger for that. I think that's, drivers parking properly. And the wheel stop is actually more of an enforcement nightmare than the parking, encroaching onto those other aspects.
Okay, thank you.
I was just trying to clarify. So I'm looking for direction here. I'll bring these back. And if you change your mind or if you don't like what I've done, obviously when we discuss it, they're back open for conversation. So just looking for what to include in my draft or what not to include in this case. Mm-hmm. The next one that we had were screening requirement triggers. So as I mentioned, right now we have a couple outdated parking lots that don't have what I think is screening that meets our code. But because they're already developed, there's no trigger on ever compliance on that. In my previous example in West Dallas, those would be triggered on occupancy reviews. So we would make sure if you're moving into the space that you clean up the parking lot, that you remove the weeds, that you plant the bushes that are supposed to be there, et cetera. We don't have that trigger right now. Our trigger is based on the development of the parking lot. So to Barbara's point, when the North Shore Bank, redeveloped that space, it went through that process. So I would just look towards maybe changing the trigger of that to not be based on new development or substantial alteration, which in the case of the North Shore Pharmacy, did end up getting reviewed. But I think based on occupancy is a cleaner, more productive trigger for that component.
I think show of, let's just take a read here. Okay, general support. Okay.
The next one perhaps is a bigger discussion, but it has come up at least internally in my office here, because we do get single family homeowners that request a second parking pad. So right now the general requirements only allow for single family parcels to develop one external parking space to their garage. So all single family houses are required to have a garage for parking purposes. And then you're allowed to have one extra external parking space, but not two. Whereas a duplex is allowed to have two external parking spaces alongside their garage, acknowledging the second unit. However, those lots are oftentimes the same size. And so we'll have single family owners, who want to get that second or third car off the street, but our code prohibits them from developing that. And I think perhaps, and I'll need to look into how I would word this, but I think just the green space requirements, whether or not we change that percentage is another conversation, so that we'll keep the numbers out of it. But I think that makes more sense of a trigger, or it's not of a threshold saying, you can develop that extra parking space as long as you keep the green space requirement there. And I think that just provides flexibility for the homeowner, and it allows, once again, people to get off the street and save that for other people that might need it. So it has come up, and we have continually prohibited it. But I feel like perhaps there's a discussion that might want to be had on this concept.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Kylie Miller.
Bart, when you're talking about those parking pads, I think there was a mention in the packet about screening them. Would that be screening them from the neighboring properties instead of like screening them from the alley? Because I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that.
So yeah, right now it says any parking space needs to be screened. And I can tell you that in the rear yards along alleys, I've never seen the requirement of that enforced. Where we have enforced it at all times is if you have a parking space in your street side yard lot on a corner property. But if you're parking your car in your backyard, planting bushes around it, I don't know what that's going to do to anyone. So yeah, kind of two different components of this one. So whether or not to allow a single family homeowner to have that second space, and then whether or not the village wants to require screening of those spaces. I would suggest an openness to allowing the space, but from an enforcement standpoint and a review standpoint, screening it is difficult. And I'm not sure what it gets us, because it's in the rear yard anyways, which we have less stringent standards for.
But your recommendation is to keep the corner lot screen requirement?
Yes, because yep, that's visible from the public right of way.
Yep, okay.
Yeah, I will tell you, when we got a variance for our 6-foot fence, we had a triplex next to us that's since been converted to a one family. And there was a large parking pad. And I don't think anybody wants to sit on their patio and look at what looks like a parking lot. So that's why I wondered about the screening. Are we going to keep some kind of requirement of open space on that, say, the alley lot line? So when the snow plows go through, that there's some place to put snow. I'm just not sure, what the current requirements we're thinking of, with snow removal or snow storage or something part of that. Anyway, it's just a thought.
Yeah, I don't know that it's currently reviewed when we do that, but I will make a mental note of that and a physical note as well, and see what we can do with respect to snow storage if we were to expand, you know, rear yard parking opportunities, just to make sure that we're not creating more of a problem in doing that. So yeah, point, Barbara, I will look into that.
Other comments from the commissioners? I have a comment. I mean, I'm interested to see what you bring back in terms of the snow removal. It's an interesting question. I am definitely in support of allowing flexibility for people to create another parking space for themselves if they own the property, because I know that people do it illegally, and so that brings up issues for alley residents, that there's this kind of resentment around people doing it anyway. So I think to deregulate that is a good thing. And I'm not sure about that we can require snow storage on private property. So I'm interested in learning a little bit more about that, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the intention. And I would, so let's say, so what Bart is suggesting is that we keep the screening from the right of way on corner lots, that we drop the screening in rear yard parking, and that we allow flexibility to develop a second space for single families, residences. So thumbs up, thumbs down, more discussion. Crystal, it looks like you can't vote. All right, looks like we have consensus on that. Thank you very much.
And then the last topic would just be the special exception component, which, you know, we've just gone through the process. As we've noted, it does not require any sort of neighborhood notice at this point. There has been discussion, at least internally with several other people, that I think it makes sense to align those notification standards with the same as our conditional use standards. Or not that 200-foot notice is acceptable or not. I guess we can discuss the number on that, but I think from a consistency standpoint and administration standpoint, it makes complete sense to treat a special exception application the same as we would to a conditional use, which also has the same notifications as the Board of Appeals and Design Review Board. So I think it's a pretty easy concept to understand that we should do that. And I just be incorporating that language in there. But if there's anything else with that process that we've just learned, you know, that we'd like to look at, I'd also be open to those discussion points.
Yeah, I really appreciate when we did a review of that, that for some reason this is the only thing that's not required for notification. So it makes sense to align it in my mind. Show of hands from the straw poll on the commission. Let's see. All right. You got direction there.
So yeah, those are my main overall questions. Once again, the ratios I think will be a larger discussion that I'll need to compile some data for, but I'd be happy to do that, to pull the data together and provide some recommendations for our July meeting, which would be scheduled for July 27th.
Okay. I have a question, clarification. What's the difference between parking code and parking regulation? So like 2-hour parking, say, that's a parking regulation that's not part of parking code, is that right?
Correct. So that's not in the zoning chapter. So the parking code is within the zoning code. Regulations are listed, I think, in either streets or traffic section of the village code. So there's located in different locations.
Okay. And so our conversation for this purposes is not talking about regulation as far as like where you can park and for how long and what it costs.
Correct. Yep. That is outside of the zoning code. So that'd be a village board discussion.
Okay.
The commission focuses on the zoning code as best as we can. So yep, that would be a board, straight to the board kind of discussion.
Okay. All right. So that concludes Bart's questions. It is 8:15. Just because I like playing with fire, do you want to do a weigh in around what people are thinking parking ratio wise? I mean, basically because, you know, we're at 1.75 in Shorewood. Whitefish Bay is what, 1.25 or 1.5?
1.5 plus required guest parking. So.
Okay. And then Milwaukee's at 1 with reductions?
They're at 1-to-1 in their low density district, but in their medium to high density, they're at 2-to-3, right. So 0.67 per unit.
Right. So I'm just, no pressure, but if any commissioners want to weigh in around if they have a comfort level, that's, I'm open to that. You are not required to, and if you want to wait, that's okay too. So I see 2 hands, Commissioner Kylie Miller and Commissioner Wickland.
I think it would be hard for me to have an opinion on this until we have some more data, you know, until we really know about, you know, the tenants in the existing apartment buildings. It's, you know, it's just our best guess. It'd be nice just to know and find out, you know, 2 bedrooms. How, you know, how many cars do those people have, or, you know, building by building, you know, kind of what each situation is.
So clarification, Barbara, it's, so you're saying that you would not make a decision until you had that type of data. So we would need to compile that apartment building by apartment building. Is that your expectation?
Well, I think surveys have been mentioned a couple times. And I know in the email that we got today from your colleague on the village board, he had talked about the number of larger apartment buildings on Capitol. Of course, we know there's several on North Oakland as well. So it would be helpful to know, you know, what's a good number to shoot for? Is 1.75 ridiculous? Is it pretty accurate? You know,
I guess what,
especially for those of us who are homeowners, you know, we're kind of, you know, it's not a problem for us. So it would be helpful to know, you know, what is the real need. The gentleman who spoke at our last meeting, who owned the apartment building and the parking lot at the corner of Prospect and Stoll, indicated, as I recall, he had 30 apartments and his surplus lot was insufficient for their tenants and who had difficulty finding parking on the street. So, I mean, that's the only information that I have. So, you know, I don't want to make a decision based on one person.
Yeah, as the chair, I just want to set a clear expectation for staff of what BART is coming back to and if it's manageable. So that's why I'm clarifying. I'm not questioning whether it would be helpful or not. I'm asking what your expectation is for July 27th.
Well, if it's possible, I don't know if BART has contact information for these property owners. You know, if an email to them or some other, you know, quick call could be made. I have no idea what the number is, you know. I just think that would be very helpful for all of us.
Bart, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I will be realistic and say that is not possible. What I can provide by the July 27th meeting would be a listing of apartment buildings and the number of spaces that they offer, but I can't go, you know, unit by unit to ask what their current parking spaces are. With the listing that I could provide, I think that would give you, as the Plan Commission, a general understanding of what's provided. And if you know that area, and if you know that area is a quote unquote problem of parking, you could probably relate that to, you know, a need for more within those developments. But there's no way realistically that we can get a unit by unit, you
survey,
right, resource on that. So I will do my best to get you a list of multifamily buildings and the number of spaces that they currently offer. Give you a general understanding of how that looks, you know, on the village street and elsewhere. So that I can do.
Okay.
Thank you, Bart. I appreciate that.
Great. So we'll have a pretty good sense of parking provisions at our next meeting. So thank you. Dan.
I lowered my hand, but I didn't unmute. I guess what I'd like to see, Bart, is, you know, there are comments on the comparisons between Milwaukee, Whitefish Bay, and Shorewood. I don't want to do an exercise necessarily of comparing them, which I know you weren't doing. You know, you're providing us the data. But I think more information, like some of the articles you provided and kind of trends, and also looking forward into the future, mean, I don't want to start trying to match other municipalities. We are unique, and I think that's important to recognize. So I think that data you've been compiling and to kind of continue in that direction, and you probably have much better ideas than us on what those recommendations should be. So I'd like to see what you take that data you found, put it into, you know, whatever format we're going to try to look at to implement. And then I think we can have a robust discussion around that. So I guess, you know, President McKay, instead of like saying today, let's go through all these, I'd rather have Bart's knowledge in front of us so we look smarter than we are, and kind of make decisions based off of that.
Appreciated. Josh.
Yeah, I was just hoping, Bart, that perhaps in lieu of like estimating demand by asking each complex, we could look to see at how many either daytime use parking permits were requested or overnights as a proxy.
Great data source.
Yep, I can try to pull that from, we're transitioning software provider, so it might be a little awkward, but I definitely can try to get that information.
Much appreciated.
Trustee Backhorst.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, maybe we could also get a list, the number of, excuse me, daytime parking passes that are requested by people who live in duplexes or single-family homes. Because I know in the some of the congested districts, if you live in an apartment building, you're not able to get a daytime pass, whereas if you own a home or live in a house or a duplex, you are. And that might be something for future consideration, though, of looking and seeing if everyone who does request that actually needs that that spot on the street, if they have a driveway or ample parking, even if it involves shuffling cars. But anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And also just to the point of what both, I think Josh and, well, Josh didn't say this, but Dan said, I don't feel the need for you to reach out to all the apartment owners to get that data or whatnot. And actually, I would actually, it's an interesting exercise to go through and speak to every tenant and to find all that information and contact people. And I would say that data would be more valuable than the data that would come from people who own the apartment buildings, that because they have an interest. I'm not saying that they would advocate for something based on their own self-interest, but that potential is there. So anyway, thank you.
Any final comments before we close this evening? Commissioners? Okay. All right, Bart, do you have enough to work on? Oh, Josh, did you have another?
Yeah, question? I had one really brief thing, but I don't know if now is the right time, but it was just regarding just the public feedback that we're getting as we're going through this process. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to thank them for their comments, but I just want to say that I'm particularly interested in you helping me understand what you want in terms of a quality of life. Telling me your philosophy that you don't like developers or something like that is totally fine, but that doesn't help me understand like what I should be crafting policy towards. So if you could describe that in terms of like what you want to see when you come out of your house, or what types of things you don't want to have, or like what's a reasonable amount of cars on your street. Those types of things would really help me understand like what you mean by your Shorewood, because I don't have your perception. How's it?
Thank you. I think that's a great direction. I had made a note of kind of how do we assess for what's a problem area? Because we did do a parking analysis and transportation study, and there weren't kind of hot spots like that. And I don't know if it was because it was not part of the scope or the design of the study, or that it didn't raise that threshold. So I think it'll be really, I think every good process is a combination of qualitative and quantitative. So that'll just be something that we work through with decision making. Was there another hand? Trustee Backhorst.
Yeah, sorry. So to that point, maybe we'll ping pong off each other, but vision. So I would encourage anyone to not only read some of our planning and vision statements and documents that exist in the village, not just to feel better about decisions that might be made by this body or anybody, but also to help find ways that we can improve these visions. Because, for example, the Vision 2025 is set to expire not too far off. And we should be looking forward, and I think that we have to, or we will be working in the next couple of years, hopefully, on updating that. And then that goes to Josh's point, which talks about, you know, what is it that we're looking for? If, you know, if we're looking for low density, or if we're looking, not more or less the specifics, but more the general concepts. Like, do we want to be a vibrant community, a walkable community? And then we have staff and experts and stuff like that that help us get there. And we do have implementation plans for the Vision 2025. They're kind of, we need to dust them off a little bit, but I know staff does a really good job of in notes, in memos, and in our board packets, at least at the village board, of including that kind of information, that this reflects our village statement, you know, of this, this, and this. So maybe that is a gentle reminder of us getting back to that. And I would encourage the planning commissioners, of course, to read those documents as well. Vision 2025 has a nice white page, and then with, you know, with the main points, and then you can get go really deep.
Okay. All right, one final comment from Barbara, if you have something additional to add, and then I'll probably suggest that we close this item and call for adjournment.
Great. Following on Trustee Bachor's comment, just a reminder that we spent more than 6 months crafting our newly adopted comprehensive 2040 plan, which is supposed to be the highest plan in the village. So when we're looking to do anything in the village, whether it's form-based zoning, which I hope we get to in the next several months, or crafting a new vision statement, that should kind of be our Bible. So I just think we always need to remember, we just went through this, you know, for Bart, it was more painful than for most of us, but even with the consultant to help us as well.
Did that involve public comment and a lot of stakeholder?
Not nearly as much as we hoped for, unfortunately, but quite a bit. And
it wasn't for lack of trying. It wasn't for trying. So
it wasn't. So it wasn't like the comprehensive plan. I mean, sorry. Okay, gotcha.
Hey, right. You guys, why don't you two
talk offline?
Talk offline. Go out for dinner. Okay. Carpool though, because there's no parking. All right. I was item 4, future agenda items.
I can just make a note that we will have 2 conditional use permits for review in July. One of them relating to a fitness center, one of them relating to a small clinic once again. So in addition to bringing back parking, we will have those 2 items as public hearings prior to that discussion.
Do either of them involve parking?
No.
Great.
Because they don't meet the threshold of substantial alteration. So that's where
I'm just taking it personally that all these fitness places are coming in, because like, what are somebody saying about me? You know, it's like, come on. All right. Item 5, adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a first and a second. All those in favor, show of hands, emojis, thumbs.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Nice work, Bart. Appreciate it.
Have a good night.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.